Some people spend their whole lives waiting for someone to choose them, to see past their mistakes and love them anyway. In Cedar Ridge, a dusty frontier town where forgiveness comes harder than gold, Nora Blackwood has been waiting 15 years for that kind of mercy. Once the prettiest girl at Sunday service, she now sleeps behind the general store, blamed for a fire that took 3 innocent lives. The townspeople cross the street when they see her coming, whispering prayers and curses in the same breath. Then Tobias Ridge rode down from the mountains, a weathered man with kind eyes and hands that know both violence and gentleness. When the town rejected her one last time, Nora walked up to this stranger and asked the question that would change everything. Will you be my husband? Sometimes love doesn't knock politely on your door. Sometimes it walks up bold and desperate, asking for a chance when the world has given up. What happens when 2 broken people decide to build something beautiful together? Before we jump back, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Cedar Ridge's main street, painting the weathered storefronts in shades of amber and rust. From her makeshift shelter behind Miller's general store, Nora Blackwood watched the town wake up with the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned to exist in the spaces between other people's lives. The wooden crates she had arranged into walls barely kept out the mountain wind, but they served their purpose, keeping her hidden from the disapproving eyes of decent folk. She pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders and listened to the familiar sounds of morning routine, Mrs. Patterson's heavy footsteps as she swept her porch, the creak of wagon wheels carrying fresh supplies from the outlying farms, the cheerful chatter of children heading to school, their voices growing quiet when they passed too close to her hiding place. 15 years. 15 years of this half-life, this existence on the edges of a community that had once embraced her as one of their own. Nora closed her eyes and let herself remember just for a moment what it felt like to belong somewhere. She had been Nora Whitfield then, daughter of the town's most respected banker, engaged to marry the minister's son. Her wedding dress had been ordered all the way from San Francisco, made of ivory silk with pearl buttons that caught the light like tiny stars. She could still feel the weight of that dress in her hands, the promise it represented of a life filled with purpose and love. Now that same dress lay folded at the bottom of her single traveling bag, its delicate fabric torn and yellowed with age. She kept it not out of hope, but as a reminder of how quickly everything could change. The fire had started on the October evening in 1859, when the autumn wind carried sparks from the blacksmith's forge across the street to the one-room schoolhouse. By the time anyone realized what was happening, the wooden building was engulfed in flames. 3 children, little Mary Catherine, 6-year-old Thomas, and 9-year-old Samuel, had been inside, staying late to help their teacher prepare for the harvest festival. Nora had been walking past when she heard the screams. Without thinking, she had run toward the burning building, not away from it. She remembered the heat hitting her face like a physical blow, the acrid smoke that burned her lungs, the way the flames seemed to reach for her with hungry orange fingers. She had managed to pull 2 children to safety before the roof collapsed, but it hadn't been enough. The 3rd child, Samuel Morrison, a freckle-faced boy who reminded everyone of his late father, had perished in the flames. In the chaos and grief that followed, someone had seen Nora emerging from the building and jumped to the worst possible conclusion. She was there when it started, old Henrik Jakobsen had declared, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Saw her with my own eyes, standing near the building just before the flames took hold. The accusation had spread through the town like wildfire itself. Nora's own father, devastated by the community's suspicion and his failing bank, had taken his own life rather than face the shame. Her fiancé had broken their engagement in a letter delivered by his father, too cowardly to face her himself. Within 6 months, Nora Whitfield had become Nora Blackwood, She had taken her mother's maiden name to distance herself from the scandal, and found herself living on the charity of strangers who whispered prayers for her soul while crossing themselves when she passed. Now she stirred from her memories as the sound of hoofbeats echoed down the main street. It wasn't unusual. Cedar Ridge sat at the crossroads between 3 cattle ranches and the mining camps up in the mountains, but something about this rider made her peer around the corner of her shelter. The man who had just ridden into town looked like he had stepped out of the wilderness itself. Tall and broad-shouldered, he sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone who had spent more time in the saddle than on foot. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, tied back with a leather cord, and his clothes were practical, rather than decorative, worn leather, sturdy cotton, everything built to last. But it was his eyes that caught Nora's attention. Even from a distance, she could see they were the color of storm clouds, and they held a depth that spoke of experiences most men never faced. He scanned the street with the careful attention of someone accustomed to danger, taking in every detail, before dismounting in front of the $Silver Saloon. "Well, I'll be damned," she heard Miller say to his wife as they watched from their store's front window. "That's Tobias Ridge. Haven't seen him in these parts for nigh on 20 years. That mountain man?" Mrs. Miller's voice carried a note of nervous excitement. "Heard tell he's killed more men than cholera. Don't believe everything you hear. A woman, but I'll grant you this, he's not a man you'd want to cross." Nora found herself studying the stranger with an interest she hadn't felt in years. There was something about the way he moved, deliberate and sure, that reminded her of the mountain cats that sometimes ventured down from the high country. Dangerous, yes, but not malicious. Simply careful. As if sensing her scrutiny, Tobias Ridge turned his head in her direction. For a heart-stopping moment their eyes met across the dusty street. Nora expected to see the same mixture of disgust and pity that she had grown accustomed to, but instead found something she couldn't quite identify. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. Then the moment passed and he disappeared into the saloon, leaving Nora to wonder if she had imagined the whole exchange. The rest of the morning passed in its usual pattern of small humiliations and quiet desperation. She ventured out only when necessary, timing her movements to avoid the busiest parts of the day. A trip to the well for water when most people were at lunch. A careful search through the refuse behind the hotel restaurant for anything edible that hadn't spoiled. It was during one of these foraging expeditions that she found the music box, half buried beneath a pile of broken dishes and rotted vegetables. The small wooden box looked like it had been damaged in a fire. Its once bright paint was charred and peeling, and one corner had been completely burned away. But when Nora picked it up and wound the tiny key, it still played its haunting melody. She recognized the song immediately. Barbara Allen. A ballad about love and loss that her mother used to sing while she worked in the garden. The melody was thin and wavering now, played on damaged clockwork, but it was still beautiful in its way. As she listened, Nora found herself remembering the schoolhouse as it had been before the fire. She had volunteered there sometimes, helping the younger children with their letters and numbers. The music box had sat on Miss Andrews' desk, a gift from her students the previous Christmas. The children had loved to gather around it during recess, listening to its sweet song while Miss Andrews told them stories. Now Miss Andrews was gone. She had left Cedar Ridge within a month of the fire, unable to bear the memories, and the music box was just another casualty of that terrible night. Like so many other things, its beauty had been scarred, but not completely destroyed. Nora slipped the damaged treasure into her bag and made her way back to her shelter. As she settled into her corner behind the store, she became aware of voices drifting from the saloon across the street. The usual afternoon crowd of cowboys and drifters, probably, sharing drinks and tales of their travels. But one voice stood out from the rest, deep and measured, with the careful cadence of someone who chose his words deliberately. She recognized it even though she had never heard it before. It belonged to the mountain man, Tobias Ridge. "Looking for work," he was saying in response to some unheard question. "Have been too long since I've had decent company." There was laughter at this, good-natured rather than mocking. Whatever reputation preceded him, it seemed the men of Cedar Ridge respected rather than feared him. "Plenty of work to be had," came another voice, one Nora recognized as belonging to Frank Morrison, Samuel's uncle, and one of her harshest critics. "Ranch hands are always needed, and the mines up north are hiring. Course depends on what kind of work you're looking for." "Honest work," Tobias replied simply. Never had much use for the other kind. More laughter, and then the conversation moved on to other topics, but Nora found herself thinking about those two words, honest work. When was the last time anyone in Cedar Ridge had associated her with honest anything? As the afternoon wore on, she noticed Tobias emerge from the saloon and walk slowly down the main street. He moved with that same deliberate grace she had observed earlier, but now she could see there was more to it than simple caution. He was studying the town, learning its rhythms and personalities the way a tracker might study animal signs. He paused in front of the church, reading the sign that announced Sunday services and prayer meetings. He nodded respectfully to Mrs. Patterson when she emerged from the dry goods store, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that spoke of ingrained courtesy. When a group of children ran past, chasing a runaway chicken, he stepped aside to let them pass and actually smiled at their laughter. This was not the behavior of a dangerous outlaw or a wild mountain hermit. This was a man with manners, someone who understood how to live among civilized people, even if he chose not to most of the time. As evening approached, Nora prepared for what was always the hardest part of her day, finding something to eat. Hotels sometimes had scraps, but that meant risking an encounter with guests who might recognize her shame. The saloon threw out food that was too old to serve, but getting to it meant crossing the main street when it was busy with foot traffic. She was weighing her options when she became aware of someone approaching her hiding place. Heavy footsteps, confident but not hurried, male by the sound of them, and unfamiliar. Nora held her breath and pressed herself deeper into the shadows, hoping whoever it was would pass by without noticing her. But the footsteps stopped just outside her makeshift shelter. "Ma'am?" The voice was the same one she had heard from the saloon. Deep, careful, respectful. "Don't mean to intrude, but I wondered if you might be hungry." Slowly, Nora emerged from behind her wall of crates. Tobias Ridge stood there with a plate in his hands, steam still rising from whatever was on it. In the fading light, his storm cloud eyes looked almost gentle. "I ordered more than I could eat," he continued, as if finding homeless women behind stores was the most natural thing in the world. Seemed ashamed to let it go to waste. Nora stared at him, too surprised to speak. In 15 years, no one, no Wanda had offered her food without expecting something in return, or making her feel like a beggar for accepting it. "Thank you," she managed finally, her voice rusty from disuse. That's very kind." He set the plate down on one of her crates and stepped back to give her space. "We all need help sometimes," he said simply. No shame in it. Then he was gone, disappearing back toward the saloon with that same easy stride, leaving Nora alone with the first act of unconditional kindness she had experienced in longer than she could remember. She looked down at the plate. Beef stew, still warm, with a thick slice of bread on the side. Real food, not scraps or leavings. Food that had been prepared for her, given freely, without judgment or expectation. For the first time in 15 years, Nora Blackwood allowed herself to wonder what it might feel like to be chosen by someone who saw her as worthy of simple human kindness. Market day in Cedar Ridge brought out the worst in people, Nora had learned. Something about the crowd and the competition for the best goods made tongues sharper and hearts smaller. She usually avoided the town square on Saturdays, but her water had run out and the well behind Miller's store had run dry. She waited until mid-afternoon, when most of the trading would be done and the crowd would be thinning. Wrapping her shawl around her head to partially conceal her face, she made her way toward the public well at the center of the square. The wooden bucket felt heavier than usual as she lowered it into the depths. Her arms had grown thin over the years, weakened by irregular meals and the constant stress of survival. But she managed to draw up the water and began to pour it into her own small pail. "Well, look what we have here." The voice belonged to Margaret Hutchins, the banker's wife and unofficial leader of Cedar Ridge's moral crusaders. Nora's blood went cold as she recognized the tone, sweet as honey on the surface, with poison underneath. "Ladies, would you look at this?" Margaret continued, her voice carrying across the square. "The town's charity case is taking water from the same well as decent folk." Nora kept her eyes down and tried to finish her task quickly, but her hands were shaking now, and water slopped over the sides of her pail. "Seems to me," said another voice, Prudence Garrett, the minister's wife, "that someone who brings such shame to our community ought to find her own water source. Maybe up in the mountains with the other wild things." A small crowd was gathering now, drawn by the promise of entertainment at someone else's expense. Nora recognized most of the faces, though few would meet her eyes directly. These were people she had grown up with, attended church with, shared meals with in better times. "Please," Nora said quietly, her voice barely audible. "I just need water." "What she needs," declared Frank Morrison, pushing through the crowd with fire in his eyes, "is to get out of our town. 15 years we've tolerated her presence. 15 years we've let her take charity that should go to deserving families, all while my nephew lies cold in the ground because of her." The accusation hit Nora like a physical blow. She had heard it countless times, but it never stopped hurting. Never stopped feeling like a knife twisting in her chest. "I didn't," she began, but Morrison cut her off. "Didn't what? Didn't set that fire? Didn't kill those children? Then why were you the first one there? Why were you the only one who came? Out alive?" The crowd murmured agreement. Old wounds were reopening, old anger flaring back to life. Nora could feel the hostility washing over her in waves, threatening to drown her where she stood. "I tried to save them," she whispered. "I tried to save Samuel. I would have died trying." "Pretty words," Morrison spat. "But words don't bring back the dead, do they? Words don't undo the evil that was done that night." Someone in the crowd, she couldn't see who, threw a handful of mud that splattered across her skirt. Then another. Soon the air was filled with dirt and small stones, while voices rose in a chorus of condemnation. "Get out! Murderer! Devil's spawn!" Nora dropped her water pail and raised her arms to protect her face. But she didn't run. 15 years of this treatment had taught her that running only made it worse, gave them permission to chase her like a wounded animal. Better to stand still and endure until their anger burned itself out. But this time felt different. This time the hatred seemed deeper, more personal, as if they had been saving it up for years and were finally letting it all pour out at once. Through the chaos, she became aware of a new presence in the square. The crowd was parting, making way for someone. The shouting died down to nervous murmurs, and even the thrown objects stopped flying. Tobias Ridge walked through the gathering like Moses, parting the Red Sea. His expression was calm, but there was something in his bearing that made even the angriest townspeople step back. He didn't look at any of them, didn't acknowledge their existence. His attention was focused entirely on Nora. "Ma'am," he said when he reached her, his voice cutting through the sudden quiet like a blade. "Are you hurt?" Nora looked up at him. Through tears, she hadn't realized she was crying. His storm-gray eyes held the same gentleness she had seen the night before, but now there was steel underneath it. He was offering her protection, she realized, not just physical safety, but something more precious, dignity. "I'm all right," she managed to say, though they both knew it wasn't true. Tobias nodded and turned to face the crowd. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Seems to me," he said slowly, "that this lady has as much right to water as anyone else in this town. Maybe more, seeing as how she's been living here longer than some of you have been drawing breath." Frank Morrison, emboldened by the crowd at his back, stepped forward. "This doesn't concern you, stranger. This is town business, is it?" Tobias asked, and somehow the question sounded more dangerous than any threat. "Because what I see is a bunch of grown folks throwing mud at a woman who can't fight back. Where I come from, we call that cowardice." The word hung in the air like a challenge. Several of the men in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, suddenly finding their boots very interesting to look at. "You don't know what she's done," Morrison insisted, but his voice had lost some of its conviction. "Don't know what she's supposed to have done," Tobias corrected. "But I know what I see right now, and what I see is shameful." He turned back to Nora and offered her his arm, as if she were a fine lady at a church social instead of a homeless woman covered in mud. "Would you do me the honor of walking with me, ma'am?" he asked. Nora stared at him in shock. No one had offered her such courtesy. In 15 years. No one had treated her like she was worth protecting, worth defending. She started, then stopped. What was she supposed to say? How was she supposed to respond to such unexpected kindness? "I don't even know your name," she whispered. "Tobias Ridge," he said simply. "And you are?" Nora Blackwood." "Well, Miss Blackwood," he said, and she noticed he didn't correct himself to Mrs., despite her age. "Would you care to take a walk with me? I find the company in this square somewhat lacking." The crowd watched in stunned silence as Nora placed her hand on his offered arm. She could feel the strength in him, the solid warmth that spoke of safety and protection. When was the last time anyone had made her feel safe? They had taken perhaps 10 steps when Nora stopped. The kindness, the dignity he was offering her, it was more than she had dreamed of receiving. But it wasn't enough, not anymore. 15 years of existing in the shadows had taught her that small kindnesses, while precious, were temporary. People moved on, forgot, found other causes to occupy their attention. If she was ever going to have a real life, a real place in the world, she needed something permanent, something that couldn't be taken away by gossip or the whims of public opinion. She needed to belong to someone who would choose to keep her. "Mr. Ridge," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. He stopped and turned to face her, those storm-cloud eyes curious and patient. Nora took a deep breath and asked, the question that would change everything, "Will you be my husband?" The silence that followed was so complete that she could hear the wind rustling through the cottonwoods at the edge of town. Every person in the square stood frozen, as if her words had turned them all to stone. Tobias studied her face for a long moment, and Nora saw something shift in his expression. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition of a desperation that matched his own. "Yes," he said simply, "I believe I will." And just like that, everything changed. The wedding took place 3 days later in the parlor of the Frontier Hotel, with only the minimum required witnesses present. Judge Patterson presided with obvious reluctance, his wife hovering nearby with the expression of someone attending a funeral rather than a wedding. Nora wore her mother's dress, not the torn wedding gown from her youth, but a simple blue Sunday dress she had carefully mended and cleaned for the occasion. It was faded and showed signs of hard wear, but it was respectable. Tobias appeared in what she suspected were his only good clothes. A clean white shirt, dark trousers, and a vest that had seen better days, but was free of patches. "Do you, Tobias Ridge, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Judge Patterson asked, his voice carrying the weight of reluctant duty. "I do," Tobias replied, his voice steady and sure. "And do you, Nora Blackwood, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," she whispered, surprised by how much she meant it. The judge pronounced them married with about as much enthusiasm as he might announce a death sentence. And just like that, Nora was no longer alone in the world. Mrs. Patterson served as witness with pressed lips and disapproving eyes, while Miller signed the certificate with nervous scratches of his pen. No one offered congratulations or best wishes. There was no celebration, no feast, no dancing, just the legal completion of what everyone clearly considered a terrible mistake. But as they walked out of the hotel together, Nora felt something. She had almost forgotten. Hope. Tobias had come to town with a pack horse carrying his worldly possessions, which turned out to be surprisingly practical. Cooking utensils, blankets, tools, a few books wrapped carefully in oiled leather. Everything. A man needed to survive in the wilderness, and nothing he didn't. "My place is about 3 hours' ride up into the mountains," he told her, as they prepared to leave Cedar Ridge behind. "It's not much, but it's solid. Built it myself 12 years ago when I first came back from—" He paused, as if deciding how much to reveal. "When I first came back from the war," Nora nodded, not pressing for details. She understood about having parts of the past that were too painful to examine too closely. He helped her onto the spare horse he had acquired for her, a gentle mare named Patience, who seemed to understand that her new rider was nervous about being so far from the ground. Nora had ridden as a child, but that felt like another lifetime now. As they rode out of town, she was acutely aware of the watching eyes. People had emerged from stores and houses to witness their departure, their expressions ranging from disapproval to outright hostility. But for the first time in 15 years, the watching didn't make her want to hide. She had someone riding beside her now, someone who had chosen to tie his name to hers, regardless of what the town thought. The trail up into the mountains was narrow and winding, following a creek that sang over smooth stones. Tobias rode with the easy confidence of someone who had traveled this path countless times, while Nora tried to remember how to move with the horse, instead of fighting it. "There," Tobias said, after they had been riding for about 2 hours, pointing toward a clearing. "Ahead. Home." Nora's first glimpse of her new home took her breath away. It wasn't large, just a single-story log cabin with a stone chimney and a covered porch, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. The logs were weathered to a warm honey color, and someone had taken care to fit them together with precision. Wildflowers grew in natural profusion around the foundation, and a vegetable garden stretched out behind the house in neat, well-tended rows. "It's perfect," she said, and meant it. Tobias glanced at her with something that might have been relief. "It's quiet," he warned. "Closest neighbor is 8 miles down the valley. Some folks find the solitude hard to bear." "I've been alone for 15 years, Nora replied, "but I've never been somewhere that felt like it could be home." He helped her down from Patience's back, and she stood for a moment just looking around. The air was cleaner up here, scented with pine and wild roses. She could hear the creek bubbling nearby, and the wind in the trees sounded like a lullaby her mother used to sing. Inside, the cabin was sparse but comfortable. A main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and 2 smaller rooms that served as bedrooms. Everything was built to last, crafted with the kind of care that spoke of someone who planned to stay in one place for a long time. "You can have the back bedroom," Tobias said, his voice carefully neutral. "I'll take the front one. That way you'll have privacy when you need it." Nora nodded, grateful for his consideration. This marriage might be a practical arrangement, but she wasn't naive enough to think they could rush into intimacy. They were still strangers, despite the legal paper that said otherwise. That first evening, they moved around each other with the careful politeness of people sharing space who weren't sure of the rules yet. Tobias showed her where things were. Kept the well, the root cellar, the smokehouse where he cured meat for winter. Nora unpacked her few belongings, trying to make the small bedroom feel like her own. In her traveling bag, wrapped carefully in a piece of faded cloth, was the damaged music box she had found behind the hotel. She wound it up and set it on the windowsill, its haunting melody floating through the evening air. "That's a pretty tune," Tobias said from the doorway. "Haven't heard it in years." "It's from the schoolhouse," Nora said quietly. "Before the fire. I found it in the refuse behind the hotel, all burned and broken, but it still plays." Tobias was quiet for a moment, studying the damaged little box. "Sometimes the broken things are the strongest," he said finally. "They've already survived the worst that can happen to them." That night, Nora lay in her narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the mountain, The hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the sigh of wind through the pines. For the first time in 15 years, she wasn't afraid of tomorrow. In the adjoining room, she could hear Tobias moving quietly around, preparing for sleep. It occurred to her that she knew almost nothing about this man who had agreed to be her husband. She didn't know where he had come from, what he had done in the war he mentioned, or why he had chosen to live alone in the mountains for so many years, but she knew he had seen her humiliated in the town square and chosen to defend her. She knew he had offered her his name and his protection without asking for anything in return. She knew he had treated her with kindness when the rest of the world saw her as less than human. Maybe that was enough to start with. Maybe the rest would come with time, if she was patient and grateful and proved herself worthy of the chance he had given her. As she drifted off to sleep, the last thing she heard was the gentle melody of the music box, its broken beauty singing her into dreams of possibility. The first week of marriage passed in a series of small discoveries and careful negotiations. Nora woke each morning before dawn, her body still programmed by years of hiding from the judgmental eyes of early risers. But instead of huddling behind crates and refuse, she found herself in a warm kitchen with actual food in the pantry and the freedom to prepare a proper breakfast. Tobias, she learned, was an early riser as well. She would emerge from her room to find him already dressed and moving quietly around the main room, banking the fire or checking his traps. He always greeted her with a polite, "Good morning, Mrs. Ridge." The name still startled her, and asked if she had slept well. "I'm not used to the quiet," she admitted on the third morning, as she stirred oatmeal at the stove. "After so many years in town, all the mountain sounds seem so loud." "You'll adjust," he said, settling at the small kitchen table. "Takes most folks a few weeks to learn the difference between normal sounds and ones that mean trouble." "Trouble?" Nora paused in her stirring. "Bears, mostly. Sometimes wolves, though they usually keep their distance. Mountain cats are the ones you really need to watch for. They're quiet until they're not." The matter-of-fact way he discussed such dangers made Nora realize how much she still had to learn about her new life. But instead of feeling frightened, she found herself oddly comforted. Tobias spoke like someone who had faced these threats and survived them. If he thought she could learn to do the same, maybe she could. She was surprised by how quickly they fell into domestic rhythms. Tobias left each morning to check his trap lines or tend to the horses, while Nora focused on making the cabin more comfortable. She mended clothes, organized the pantry, and worked in the garden. It was simple work, but it felt purposeful in a way nothing had for years. In the evenings they would sit by the fire and talk, not about anything too personal at first, the weather, the garden, practical matters about running the household. But gradually, tentatively, they began to share fragments of their pasts. "I was a soldier," Tobias told her one evening, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "Union Army, 1861 to 1865, served under Grant in the final campaigns." Nora waited, sensing there was more he wanted to say. "Saw things no man should have to see," he continued quietly. "Did things I'm not proud of. When the war ended, I couldn't go back to living around people. Seemed like everywhere I looked I saw ghosts." "Is that why you came here?" she asked gently. "Came west, looking for space to breathe. Found this place and it felt quiet, clean, like the mountains could wash some of the blood off my hands." Nora understood that kind of seeking, the need to find a place where the past couldn't follow you, where you could try to become someone new. "I haven't told you everything about the fire," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Tobias looked at her then, his grey eyes patient and non-judgmental. "I was supposed to be married the next week," she continued, "to Robert Andrews, the minister's son. The whole town was preparing for the wedding. It was going to be the social event of the season. But that night, I had gone to the schoolhouse to help Miss Andrews prepare decorations for the harvest festival." She took a shaky breath, remembering. "I had stayed late, later than I should have. Robert was expected for dinner at my father's house, and I knew I was going to be scolded for keeping everyone waiting. I was hurrying, not paying attention to anything, but getting home quickly. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney, and Nora flinched at the sound. When I saw the flames, I didn't think. I just ran toward them. I could hear children screaming inside, and I knew Miss Andrews had kept some of the younger ones after regular hours to help with the festival preparations. You saved 2 of them, Tobias said quietly. Samuel Morrison was trapped under a fallen beam. The smoke was so thick I could barely see, and the heat— She touched her left arm unconsciously, where old burn scars were hidden beneath her sleeve. I tried to reach him, tried to lift the beam, but I wasn't strong enough. The roof was starting to come down, and someone, I think it was Frank Morrison, grabbed me and pulled me out. You nearly died trying to save him. But I didn't save him, Nora said, tears threatening. He died because I wasn't strong enough, wasn't fast enough, wasn't good enough. Tobias was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached across the space between their chairs and gently took her hand in his. The fire wasn't your fault, he said, his voice firm with conviction, and that boy's death wasn't your fault either. You did everything you could. The town doesn't see it that way. The town needs someone to blame, because the alternative is admitting that sometimes bad things just happen, that sometimes there's no one to punish, no way to make sense of senseless loss. His hand was warm and calloused, marked by years of hard work and harder experiences. But his touch was gentle, and for the first time since that terrible night, Nora allowed herself to consider the possibility that he might be right. A few days later, Nora was cleaning out a drawer in the kitchen when her fingers brushed against something unexpected. Hidden beneath a stack of dish towels was a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. "Tobias?" she called, holding the box carefully. "Is this yours?" He appeared in the doorway, took one look at what she was holding and went very still. "I forgot that was there," he said quietly. The box was heavier than it looked, and when she opened it, Nora understood why. Inside, nestled in faded blue velvet, was a medal, bronze and gold, with an eagle spread across its face and a ribbon of red, white, and blue. "Medal of Honor," Tobias said, as if the words tasted bitter in his mouth. "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty." Nora looked up at him, seeing him with new eyes. "What did you do?" "Saved my regiment," he said simply. "We were trapped behind enemy lines, surrounded. Someone had to create a distraction, draw their fire long enough for the others to escape. I volunteered." "How many men did you save?" 43. The number came out flat, emotionless. "They gave me that medal, called me a hero, but all I could think about were the Confederate boys I killed to do it. They were someone's sons too, someone's brothers." Nora carefully closed the box and set it on the table between them. "Is that why you came here? To get away from being a hero?" "Being a hero is just another kind of prison," Tobias said. "People expect things from heroes. They expect you to be noble and pure and worthy of their admiration. But the truth is, I'm just a man who learned to kill efficiently and lived longer than he deserved to." For the first time since their marriage, Nora felt like she was seeing the real Tobias Ridge, not the confident mountain man who had defended her in the town square, but the wounded soldier who had been carrying his ghosts for nearly 10 years. "We make quite a pair," she said softly. "The town pariah and the reluctant hero." Something shifted in his expression then, a warmth that hadn't been there before. "Maybe that's why this works," he said. "We both know what it's like to be something we never wanted to be." That night, for the first time since their wedding, they sat closer together by the fire, not touching, but close enough that Nora could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Close enough that when he reached for another log, his sleeve brushed against her arm. It was a small thing, that brief contact, but it felt like the beginning of something larger. Trust, perhaps, or understanding, or maybe, eventually, something that might grow into love. 3 weeks into their marriage, Nora woke to the sound of screaming. She bolted upright in bed, her heart hammering as she tried to locate the source of the terrible sound. It was coming from Tobias's room, raw, anguished cries that spoke of pain beyond the physical. Without thinking, she threw on her robe and rushed to his door. She found him thrashing in his bed, still asleep, but caught in the grip of some horrific dream. His face was twisted with anguish, and sweat soaked through his nightshirt despite the cool mountain air. "No!" he shouted, his voice breaking. "Leave them alone! They're just boys!" Nora hesitated for only a moment before moving to his bedside. She had seen this before, years ago, when Union soldiers had been brought to Cedar Ridge's makeshift hospital. Shell shock, the doctors had called it, though they had no real treatment to offer. "Tobias," she said softly, not wanting to startle him, but knowing he needed to be brought back from whatever battlefield his mind had taken him to. "Tobias, you're safe. You're home." He didn't respond to her voice, so she gently placed her hand on his shoulder. The contact seemed to anchor him somehow. His thrashing slowed, though he continued to mutter broken words about blood and death and the weight of command. "It's all right," she murmured, the way she might soothe a frightened child. "The war is over. You're in the mountains now, remember? You're safe." Gradually his breathing slowed and the terrible tension left his muscles. He was still asleep, but the nightmare had passed. Nora stayed beside him until she was certain he was resting peacefully, then quietly returned to her own room. In the morning, Tobias appeared for breakfast, looking haggard and embarrassed. He couldn't meet her eyes as he mumbled his way through his usual polite greeting. "Bad night?" Nora asked gently, setting a plate of eggs and bacon in front of him. "Did I wake you?" His voice was rough with exhaustion and shame. "I'm sorry. Sometimes the dream—" He trailed off, unable to finish. "And there's nothing to apologize for," Nora said firmly. "We all carry our wounds." She rolled up her left sleeve, revealing for the first time the network of burn scars that covered her arm from wrist to elbow. The skin was puckered and discolored, a permanent reminder of that terrible night 15 years ago. "I got these trying to lift the beam that was trapping Samuel Morrison," she said quietly. "The doctors said I was lucky. A few more seconds and I would have lost the arm entirely. But for years afterward, I couldn't bear the smell of smoke or the sight of an open flame without remembering." Tobias stared at the scars, his expression shifting from shame to understanding, to something deeper, recognition perhaps of a kindred spirit. "How do you bear it?" he asked. "The memories, the guilt." "Some days I don't," Nora admitted. "Some days I wake up and the first thing I think about is that little boy's face, and I want to pull the blankets over my head and never come out. But then I remember that surviving isn't just about me anymore. Samuel died, but those other 2 children lived. Mary Catherine is married now, with babies of her own. Thomas runs his father's store. They lived because I was there that night." She pulled her sleeve back down and sat across from him at the table. "Your 43 soldiers lived because you were there too," she said. "Whatever you had to do to save them, however many ghosts you carry because of it, their children are growing up with fathers because of your choices that day." Tobias was quiet for a long time, staring at his untouched breakfast. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion he was trying to control. "I tell myself that," he said. "But late at night, when the dreams come, all I can see are the faces of the boys I killed. Confederate boys, most of them no older than 18 or 19. They had mothers who loved them, sweethearts waiting for them to come home. And if you hadn't killed them, your 43 soldiers would never have made it home to their mothers and sweethearts," Nora pointed out gently. "War is a terrible thing, Tobias. It forces good people to make impossible choices, but that doesn't make you evil for making them." That afternoon, while Tobias was out checking his trap lines, Nora found herself drawn to the small trunk he kept at the foot of his bed. She had noticed it before, but had never presumed to look inside. Even in a marriage of convenience, everyone deserved their privacy. But something about their conversation that morning had changed the boundaries between them. They were no longer quite strangers sharing a house, but not yet true intimates either. They existed in some middle space, learning to trust each other with their deepest wounds. Inside the trunk, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, was a Bible. Not the fancy, leather-bound kind used for church services, but a simple field Bible, small enough to carry in a soldier's pack. The pages were stained and worn, and pressed between them were wildflowers, dozens of them carefully preserved. Nora lifted one of the flowers, recognizing it as mountain laurel, the same kind that grew wild around their cabin. As she did, a piece of paper fluttered to the floor. She picked it up and found herself looking at a photograph, a tintype of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, "To my darling Tobias, until we meet." Again, "All my love, Catherine, a wife." Tobias had been married before to this beautiful woman who had pressed flowers in his Bible and sent him off to war with her photograph tucked close to his heart. Nora felt a stab of something that might have been jealousy, followed immediately by shame. Of course, there had been someone before her. A man like Tobias, honorable, brave, gentle, would not have reached his age without knowing love. The question was, what had happened to Catherine? And why did Tobias carry her memory like just another ghost from a war that should have ended years ago? She was still holding the photograph when she heard his boots on the porch. Quickly she tucked it back into the Bible and closed the trunk, but she couldn't quite shake the image of that gentle face or the loving inscription on the back. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Nora found herself studying her husband's profile and wondering about the woman who had loved him first. Had she been everything Nora was not, respected, pure, untouched by scandal? Had their love been the kind poets wrote about, pure and sweet and unmarked by desperation? And if so, how could a practical marriage between two damaged souls ever hope to measure up to such a memory? The strangers arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September, when the aspen leaves were turning gold and the first frost had touched the high meadows. Nora was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she heard the sound of multiple horses approaching, too many horses for a casual visit. She moved to the front porch, where she could see the trail, shading her eyes against the morning sun. 3 men rode toward the cabin with the purposeful bearing of people on official business. They were well dressed by frontier standards, their horses expensive, their saddles tooled leather that spoke of money and influence. The man in the lead was tall and thin, with the pale complexion of someone who spent more time indoors than out. His companions looked like hired muscle, broad-shouldered and alert, with the kind of eyes that missed nothing. Tobias emerged from the barn, his rifle held casually but ready. Nora had learned to read his moods over the past month, and she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his gaze catalogued potential threats and escape routes. "Morning, gentlemen," he called out as they approached. His voice was polite but wary. "Something I can help you with?" The thin man dismounted and removed his hat with practiced courtesy. "Mr. Ridge, I presume. I'm Charles Blackwood, representing the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. These are my associates, Mr. Kane and Mr. Sullivan." Blackwood. Nora's breath caught in her throat. That had been her father's name, before she had taken her mother's maiden name to escape the scandal. But surely it was just coincidence. Blackwood was common enough. "Railroad business up here?" Tobias asked, not lowering his rifle. "Seems like you boys are a long way from the nearest track." "Indeed we are," Blackwood agreed with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "But that's precisely why we're here. The railroad is planning to extend a line through this valley within the next 2 years. We're in the process of acquiring the necessary land rights." "This is my land," Tobias said flatly. "Filed on it legally, paid my fees, worked it for 12 years. Not interested in selling. I understand your attachment, Mr. Ridge. A man's home is sacred, after all. But progress waits for no one, and the railroad serves the greater good. We're prepared to offer you a generous price, more than generous, really. enough to buy yourself a fine spread somewhere else, perhaps closer to civilization. Nora stepped, forward, drawn by something in the man's tone that set her teeth on edge. As she drew closer, she got a better look at his face, and her blood turned to ice in her veins. She knew those features. The sharp nose, the pale eyes, the way his mouth turned down at the corners when he was displeased. She had seen them every day for the first 22 years of her life, reflected in mirrors and family portraits. This wasn't just any Charles Blackwood. This was her cousin Charlie, whom she hadn't seen since her father's funeral 15 years. Her recognition flickered in his eyes as well, followed quickly by something that looked like satisfaction. "Well, well," he said softly, "if it isn't little Nora Whitfield. Though I hear you go by Blackwood now, using our family name without permission, I'm told." Tobias's grip on his rifle tightened. "You know my wife?" "Know her?" Charlie laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "She's my dear cousin. Though I must say, Nora, you've come up in the world. From town pariah to mountain man's wife, quite an improvement." "What do you want, Charlie?" Nora asked, finding her voice despite the fear clawing at her chest. "What I want is to complete my business with your husband," he replied smoothly. "The railroad needs this land, Nora, all of it. Every acre from here to the main valley. Your little domestic arrangement is standing in the way of progress." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. "This is a survey map of the entire region, Mr. Ridge. Notice anything interesting about it?" Tobias took the map and studied it, his expression growing darker with each moment. Nora moved to his side and looked over his shoulder. The map showed their land and the surrounding area in precise detail, but it was marked with symbols she didn't recognize. Red X's scattered across the terrain like a rash. "Mineral deposits," Charlie explained helpfully. "Copper, silver, possibly gold. The geological survey was completed last month. This entire valley is sitting on a fortune, and the railroad intends to claim it." "Under what authority?" Tobias demanded. "Under the authority of the United States government and the Pacific Railroad Act. The railroad has been granted eminent domain privileges. We can take what we need for the greater good of the nation, with or without your cooperation." One of his companions, the one called Kane, shifted in his saddle and let his coat fall open, revealing the gun holstered at his hip. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. "Of course," Charlie continued, "it would be so much more civilized if we could reach an agreement. I'm authorized to offer you $500 for your claim, a fair price for what amounts to worthless mountain scrub." "Worthless scrub that's sitting on a mineral fortune?" Nora interjected. "Charlie, even you can't be that stupid." His pale eyes flashed with anger. "Still sharp-tongued, I see. Some things never change. Tell me, Nora, does your husband know about your colorful past? Does he know you're a murderer?" The word hung in the air like a physical blow. Nora felt Tobias go rigid beside her, though whether from anger or doubt she couldn't tell. "She's not a murderer," Tobias said quietly, but his voice carried the kind of danger that made smart men step back. "Oh, but she is," Charlie replied with obvious relish. "Burned down the schoolhouse in Cedar Ridge. 3 children died, including a little boy whose only crime was staying late to help his teacher. The whole town knows what she did." "The whole town is wrong," Tobias said. "Are they? Were you there that night, Mr. Ridge? Did you see what really happened? Really? Or are you taking the word of a woman desperate enough to propose marriage to a complete stranger?" Nora watched her husband's face, searching for some sign of what he was thinking. After everything they had shared, all the trust they had built, would he really doubt her now because of Charlie's poison? "I know what I need to know about my wife," Tobias said finally. "And I know I want you off my land. Now." Charlie's smile turned cold. "I was hoping we could settle this like civilized men, but if you prefer the hard way—" He shrugged and remounted his horse. "You have until the end of the week to reconsider. After that, I'm afraid the offer will be withdrawn, and we'll proceed through other channels." As they rode away, Nora felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Charlie's unexpected appearance couldn't be coincidence. He had come here specifically because she was here, because he knew about her past and her shame. But why? What did he really want? And more importantly, would the fragile trust she and Tobias had built be strong enough to survive the storm that was coming? That night, Nora couldn't sleep. Charlie's visit had stirred up memories she had spent years trying to bury, and his threats against their land felt like another kind of fire threatening to consume everything she had finally found worth protecting. She slipped out of bed and made her way to the kitchen, thinking to make some tea to calm her nerves. But as she passed Tobias's room, she heard the familiar sounds of another nightmare beginning, the restless muttering, the sharp intake of breath that preceded the screaming. This time she didn't hesitate. She entered his room and gently placed her hand on his shoulder, whispering the words that had become a ritual between them. "You're safe, you're home, the war is over." But as Tobias's breathing settled and he sank back into peaceful sleep, Nora found herself looking around his room with new eyes. Charlie's accusations had planted seeds of doubt that she hated herself for entertaining, but couldn't quite shake. What did she really know about her husband? He had told her fragments of his story, the war, the medal, his need for solitude. But there were gaps, inconsistencies, that she had been content to overlook in her gratitude for his kindness. The trunk at the foot of his bed seemed to call to her. She had looked inside once before, had seen the Bible with its pressed flowers and the photograph of the beautiful woman named Catherine. But what else might be hidden there? Moving as quietly as she could, Nora knelt beside the trunk and lifted the lid. The Bible was there, along with some old letters tied with ribbon and a small wooden box she hadn't noticed before. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside, nestled in black velvet, was another medal, but not the Medal of Honor she had seen before. This one was different, smaller, with an inscription that made her blood run cold. For meritorious service in the investigation of civilian crimes during wartime. Awarded to Major Tobias Ridge, Provost Marshal's Office, 1864. Provost Marshal's Office. Nora's father had mentioned that name once, in hushed tones, when he thought she wasn't listening. They were the military police, the ones who investigated crimes behind Union lines, the ones who tracked down spies and saboteurs and other threats. To the war effort, the ones who sometimes had to execute people. With shaking fingers, she opened one of the letters. The handwriting was neat, official, the kind used for military correspondence. Major Ridge, your investigation into the fire at the Willowbrook Supply Depot has been completed to our satisfaction. The evidence you uncovered proving deliberate sabotage by Confederate sympathizers has resulted in the appropriate sentences being carried out. Your thorough work in this matter is commended. There were more letters, all similar. Cases investigated, evidence gathered, sentences carried out. Tobias hadn't just been a soldier, he had been a detective, a hunter of secrets and lies. And if he was still that man, if he still had those skills, Nora's hands flew to her mouth as the terrible possibility struck her. What if Charlie's visit wasn't random? What if someone had hired Tobias to investigate her, to uncover the truth about the fire in Cedar Ridge? What if their entire marriage was a lie? She was so lost in her spiraling thoughts that she didn't hear Tobias wake up behind her. She didn't realize he was there until his voice, rough with sleep and pain, cut through the silence. Find what you were looking for. Nora spun around, the letter still clutched in her hands. Tobias sat on the edge of his bed, his hair disheveled, his eyes dark with an emotion she couldn't identify. I was just, she stammered, but there was no way to explain away what she had been doing. You were searching through my private things, he said quietly, looking for evidence that I'm not who I claim to be. The hurt in his voice was like a knife to her heart, but the fear was stronger. Are you, she whispered, are you who you claim to be? Tobias was silent for a long moment, staring at the letter in her hands. Then he sighed and ran his fingers through his hair. "I was hoping you wouldn't find those," he said. "I was hoping I'd never have to explain." "Explain what? That you're some kind of spy? That you married me to investigate the fire?" "No," he said firmly. "I married you because you asked me to, and because I saw something in you that I recognized, something broken that matched what was broken in me." He stood and took the letter from her hands, his touch gentle despite the tension between them. "But you're right that I haven't told you everything," he continued. "After the war, I couldn't just stop. I had spent 4 years learning to read people, to uncover secrets, to piece together the truth from fragments and lies. It became who I was. So you kept investigating, even after the war ended?" "For a while. Private cases mostly. Missing persons, insurance fraud, the occasional adultery scandal. Nothing dramatic, nothing that required violence, but it paid well enough to keep me fed and clothed while I figured out what to do with the rest of my life." Nora felt some of the tension leave her shoulders, but questions still swirled in her mind. Then why hide it? Why pretend to be just a simple mountain man? Tobias was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Because 3 years ago, I took a case that went wrong. A man hired me to find evidence that his wife was being unfaithful. Turned out she wasn't cheating, she was trying to escape him. He had been beating her, threatening to kill her if she left. When I uncovered the truth and refused to help him find her, he trailed off." His expression darkening. "He what?" Nora pressed. "He hired men to kill me. Professional killers, the kind who don't ask questions or have consciences. I managed to survive, but barely. And I realized that no matter how carefully I chose my cases, no matter how noble my intentions, this work would always put people in danger, including anyone who cared about me." Understanding dawned on Nora like a cold sunrise. "Catherine," Tobias nodded, his face etched with pain. "She was my fiancée. We were supposed to be married in the spring of 1871. But the men who were hunting me found her first. They thought she might know where I was hiding, might have information they could use." "Oh, Tobias." The words came out as barely a whisper. "They tortured her for 2 days before they finally accepted that she truly didn't know anything useful. Then they killed her anyway, just to send me a message." Tears were streaming down Nora's face now, all her suspicions and fears forgotten. In the face of his raw grief, "I found her body a week later," he continued, his voice hollow. "Left my old life that day and came up into these mountains. Figured if I disappeared completely, if I became just another anonymous hermit, I might finally be able to stop getting people killed. But then you met me," Nora said softly. "But then I met you," he agreed. "And for the first time in 3 years, I thought maybe I could have something worth protecting again. Maybe I could be something other than a killer and a bringer of death." Nora closed the distance between them and took his hands in hers. They were shaking, she realized, though whether from grief or anger or fear she couldn't tell. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm sorry I doubted you. I'm sorry about Catherine. I'm sorry you had to carry all of that alone. And I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner," he replied. "You deserved to know what kind of man you were marrying." They held each other then, 2 damaged souls finding comfort in their shared understanding of loss and betrayal and the terrible weight of secrets. But even as Nora felt their bond deepening, a new fear was taking root in her heart. If Tobias had been a detective, if he still retained those skills, then he might be the only person who could uncover the real truth about the fire in Cedar Ridge. The truth that had been buried for 15 years beneath layers of grief and blame and willful blindness. The truth that she wasn't entirely sure she was ready to know. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor, Doc Henley, the traveling physician who made regular rounds through the mountain settlements. Nora had known him slightly in her previous life in Cedar Ridge, and she was surprised to see his familiar face emerging from the morning mist. "Mrs. Ridge." He greeted her with a tip of his hat, using her married name with the kind of respect she still wasn't accustomed to receiving. Hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I was passing through and thought you might like to know there's been some interesting developments in town." Tobias appeared from the barn, his demeanor immediately alert. "What kind of developments, Doc?" "Well, it seems your cousin Charlie Blackwood has been making quite a stir," Doc Henley said, addressing Nora directly. "Been staying at the hotel for the past week, asking all sorts of questions about the fire 15 years ago. Got people talking again, stirring up old resentments." Nora felt her stomach drop. "What kind of questions?" "Oh, the usual suspects when someone wants to dig up the past. Who was where that night, what they saw, what they heard. But here's the interesting part. He's been paying for information. Good money, too. Got some folks thinking maybe there's more to that story than they originally believed." Doc Henley accepted the cup of coffee Tobias offered him and settled into one of the porch chairs with the easy manner of a man who had delivered both good news and bad to more families than he could count. "Course, I've always had my doubts about that whole business," he continued conversationally. "Never made sense to me that a girl like Nora would set fire to a building with children inside. Known her since she was knee-high to a grasshopper, and spite was never in her nature." "You were there that night," Nora said suddenly, the memory coming back to her. "You treated the children who were rescued." "Aye, that I was. And I treated you too, if you recall. Burns on your arms and hands, smoke inhalation so bad I thought you might not make it through the night. Strange behavior for an arsonist, throwing yourself into the flames like that." Tobias leaned forward in his chair. "What else do you remember about that night, Doc?" The old physician stroked his beard thoughtfully. "Well, there was the smell, for one thing. When I arrived to treat the wounded, the whole area still reeked of coal oil. Not the kind of smell you get from an accidental fire. Someone had doused that building good and proper before setting it alight." "Coal oil?" Nora's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Aye. But here's what always bothered me. If you had set that fire, Nora, you'd have reeked of coal oil yourself. Your clothes, your hair, your skin. But when I examined you, all I could smell was smoke and burned flesh. Whatever coal oil had been used, it wasn't on you." Tobias's expression had taken on the focused intensity Nora had learned to recognize. His investigator's instincts were awakening, she realized, drawn out by the scent of a mystery that had never been properly solved. "Did you share this observation with anyone at the time?" he asked. Doc Henley snorted. "Tried to, but folks were so worked up, so desperate for someone to blame, they didn't want to hear about evidence that might complicate their tidy little narrative. Grief makes people stupid sometimes, and anger makes them cruel. But you're sharing it now," Nora observed. "Now there's someone asking the right questions and paying for honest answers instead of comfortable lies," the doctor replied. "Though, I'll admit, your cousin's motives seem less than pure. He's not looking for justice, that one. He's looking for ammunition." After Doc Henley left, Nora and Tobias sat in silence on the porch, each lost in their own thoughts. The revelation about the coal oil had shaken something loose in Nora's memory, fragments of that night that she had pushed away because they were too painful to examine. "There's something I need to tell you," she said finally. "Something I've never told anyone." Tobias waited patient as always, but she could see the investigator in him cataloguing every detail of her expression and body language. "That night, when I went to the schoolhouse to help with the decorations, I wasn't alone at first. My father was there." "Your father? At the schoolhouse?" He had been acting strangely for weeks. Secretive, nervous, staying late at the bank every night. I thought maybe he was planning something special for my wedding, but she trailed off, the memory still painful after all these years. "But what?" "But when I found him at the schoolhouse, he was burning papers, documents from the bank, I think. He had them piled in Miss Andrews' metal wastebasket, feeding them into the flames one by one." Tobias was very still now, his full attention focused on her words. "I asked him what he was doing, and he said he was protecting me, protecting our family. that there were some debts that could never be repaid, some mistakes that would destroy us all if they came to light. What kind of debts? I don't know. He wouldn't tell me. But he was crying, Tobias. I had never seen my father cry before that night. He kept saying he was sorry, that he had never meant for things to go so far. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to align in Tobias's mind. She could see it in his eyes. The same focused intensity he must have brought to his wartime investigations. What happened then? He asked quietly. I tried to convince him to come home, to talk to me about whatever was troubling him, but he said it was too late for talk, that he had made his choice and now he had to live with the consequences. Nora took a shaky breath, steadying herself. For the hardest part, he sent me away, told me to go home and pretend I had never seen him there, said he would take care of everything and that I should never speak of that night to anyone. But you didn't go home. I started to. I made it about halfway across the square before I realized I had forgotten the ribbon I was supposed to bring for the decorations. It was a silly thing, but Miss Andrews had specifically asked for it, and I didn't want to disappoint her. So you went back. So I went back. And that's when I saw the flames. They sat in silence for a moment, the implications hanging heavy in the air between them. Your father set the fire, Tobias said finally. It wasn't a question. I think so, yes, but he never intended for anyone to be hurt. The children weren't supposed to be there that late. Miss Andrews usually dismissed them by 4 o'clock, but that day she had asked a few of the older ones to stay and help prepare for the harvest festival. And your father didn't know. How could he? He was burning evidence of whatever financial crimes he had committed, trying to destroy the proof before it could destroy our family. He thought he was saving us. Tobias stood and began pacing the length of the porch, his mind working through the timeline and implications. But the townspeople found you at the scene, he said. They saw you coming out of the building and assumed I had set the fire. And I let them believe it. The words hung in the air like a confession. Why? Tobias asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer. Because my father was dead by then. Shot himself 3 days after the fire, when the guilt became too much to bear. What good would it have done to reveal the truth? It wouldn't have brought Samuel back to life. It would only have destroyed what little remained of my father's reputation and my family's name. So you sacrificed yourself to protect his memory. Nora nodded, tears streaming down her face. I thought if I carried the blame, if I accepted the punishment, it would somehow make amends for his mistake, that Samuel's death would at least serve some purpose, teaching the town to be more careful, to watch their children more closely. But it didn't work out that way. No, it just made everyone hate me. And the longer the lie went on, the harder it became to tell the truth. Who would have believed me after 5 years, 10 years, 15? Tobias stopped pacing and came to kneel beside her chair, taking her, hands in his strong, calloused ones. Charlie knows, he said quietly. That's why he's here. Somehow he's figured out the truth about that night. But how? The only evidence was destroyed in the fire. Not all of it. Your father was embezzling from the bank, wasn't he? There would have been records, discrepancies that someone with the right expertise could uncover. Charlie works for the railroad, which means he has access to financial investigators, lawyers, people who specialize in following money trails. Nora felt the walls of her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. What does he want? I think he wants this land. The mineral rights you mentioned, the railroad access, it's all worth a fortune. But as long as you're alive, and your father's crimes remain secret, you have a legitimate claim to your family's assets, including any inheritance that might include property rights or mineral claims. So he needs me discredited, publicly exposed as a murderer, so that any legal claim I might have would be invalid. Or worse, Tobias said grimly, he might need you permanently out of the picture. The implications of this settled over them like a dark cloud. Charlie wasn't just trying to buy their land or force them off it. He was systematically destroying Nora's reputation and credibility so that her death, when it came, would look like justice rather than murder. "We have to get ahead of this," Tobias said, his voice taking on the commanding tone she imagined he had used during the war. "We have to control the narrative before he does." "How?" "By telling the truth, all of it, but we have to do it right. With evidence to back up our claims. We need to prove your father's embezzlement, prove he set the fire, prove that you tried to save those children rather than harm them. The evidence was destroyed 15 years ago. Not all of it. There are always traces, always records that someone forgot to destroy, or copies that got filed in the wrong place. And I know how to find them." Nora looked at her husband, really looked at him, and saw not just the gentle mountain man who had offered her kindness, but the experienced investigator who had spent years uncovering buried truths. "You want to go back to Cedar Ridge," she said. "We want to go back to Cedar Ridge," he corrected. "Together. You're not facing this alone anymore, Nora. You have a partner now, someone who believes in you and has the skills to help prove your innocence. And if we can't find the evidence, if Charlie has already destroyed whatever traces remained," Tobias's expression hardened with the kind of determination that had carried him through 4 years of war and a decade of difficult cases. "Then we'll make him confess," he said simply. "One way or another, the truth is coming out, and when it does, you'll finally be free of the burden you've been carrying all these years." That night, as they prepared for what might be their last peaceful evening in the mountains, Nora found herself looking around the cabin with new eyes. It had become home to her in a way nowhere had been home since her childhood. The simple furniture, the warm firelight, the sense of safety and belonging, all of it would be at risk once they returned to Cedar Ridge. But as she watched Tobias carefully cleaning and checking his rifle, saw him laying out the tools of investigation he had thought never to use again, she realized that home wasn't really about the place. Home was about the person who chose to stand beside you when the world turned dark and threatening, and for the first time in 15 years, she wasn't alone. They rode into Cedar Ridge at dawn, when the streets were empty and the morning mist still clung to the storefronts like ghosts. Tobias had insisted on the early hour, fewer witnesses, he said, and the element of surprise would be on their side. Nora felt her stomach clench as they passed the site where the schoolhouse had once stood. Someone had built a small memorial there, a circle of stones with a wooden cross bearing 3 names, Mary Catherine, Thomas, and Samuel. Fresh wildflowers had been placed at its base, probably by family members who still mourned their lost children. "We'll start at the bank," Tobias said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who had faced far worse odds. "If your father was embezzling, there will be records. Banks keep everything, even when they think they've destroyed it." The Cedar Ridge Bank was a modest brick building that had seen better days. Paint peeled from the shutters, and one of the front windows had been boarded up rather than repaired. It looked like a business barely hanging on, which made sense if it had never recovered from the financial scandal that had driven Nora's father to suicide. Tobias dismounted and helped Nora down from her horse, his movements careful and deliberate. She could see him cataloguing potential threats, escape routes, anyone who might be watching them. Old habits from his investigative work, she realized. "Remember," he said as they approached the front door, "we're here as paying customers with legitimate business. You have every right to access your father's records." The man behind the counter looked up as they entered, his expression shifting from professional courtesy to barely concealed hostility when he recognized Nora. "Mrs. Ridge," he said, deliberately emphasizing her married name. "I'm afraid the bank isn't open for business yet." "Mr. Davidson," Nora replied, recognizing the assistant manager who had worked under her father. "We're not here for banking services. I need to access my father's personal records." Davidson's eyes narrowed. "Those records were sealed 15 years ago. Bank policy doesn't allow—" "Bank policy," Tobias interrupted, his voice carrying a subtle threat. allows legal heirs to access the personal papers of deceased account holders. I believe you'll find that federal banking regulations supersede local policies. And you are her husband, and a man who understands the legal consequences of obstructing legitimate inquiries. Davidson looked between them uncertainly. Clearly, he had been hoping to simply refuse them and send them on their way, but Tobias's calm confidence suggested he knew exactly what he was talking about. I would need to consult with Mr. Patterson, Davidson stammered. Judge Patterson? Nora asked. He doesn't own the bank. No, but he's been handling the legal affairs since your father. Since the incident, he's the one who sealed those records. Tobias and Nora exchanged glances. Judge Patterson was the same man who had reluctantly officiated their wedding, and his wife had been one of the witnesses. If he had been involved in sealing the bank records, it suggested the cover-up went deeper than just protecting a dead man's reputation. Then let's go see Judge Patterson, Tobias said. They found the judge in his office above the general store, a cramped space filled with legal books and stacks of papers that looked like they hadn't been disturbed in years. Patterson looked up from his desk with the expression of a man who had been expecting this visit. Mrs. Ridge, he said without warmth, I heard you were back in town. Judge Patterson, Nora replied formally. I need to access my father's bank records. Mr. Davidson says you're the one who can authorize that. Those records are sealed by court order for the protection of all parties involved. What parties? Tobias asked. The man is dead. His daughter has been living in exile for 15 years, and 3 children are in their graves. Who exactly is being protected? Patterson's eyes flicked to Tobias with obvious dislike. You must be the husband. I've heard about you. War hero turned hermit, though I wonder what a man like that sees in damaged goods like her. The insult hit its mark, and Nora flinched visibly. But Tobias's response was swift and controlled. I see a woman who has been carrying someone else's guilt for 15 years, he said quietly. I see a community that chose comfortable lies over difficult truths, and I see a judge who seems awfully invested in keeping those lies buried. Are you accusing me of something, Mr. Ridge? Not yet, but the day is young. Patterson stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger. I think this conversation is over. You have no legal standing to make demands in this town, and your wife's reputation speaks for itself. Actually, said a new voice from the doorway, I think they have every right to ask questions. They turned to see Charlie Blackwood standing in the entrance, impeccably dressed and wearing the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. Charlie, Patterson said, visibly relieved. Thank goodness you're here. These people are making wild accusations. Are they? Charlie interrupted smoothly. How fascinating. Please don't let me interrupt. I'm quite curious to hear what my dear cousin has discovered about that tragic night so many years ago. The tension in the small office was thick enough to cut with a knife. Charlie moved into the room with the confidence of a man who held all the cards, while Judge Patterson looked increasingly uncomfortable. You know, Charlie continued conversationally, I've been doing quite a bit of research into that fire myself. Amazing what you can uncover when you know where to look and have the resources to dig deep. He reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio, setting it on Patterson's desk with deliberate care. For instance, did you know that my dear uncle, Nora's father, had been systematically embezzling from the bank for nearly 2 years before his death? Small amounts at first, then larger and larger sums as his gambling debts mounted. Nora felt the room spinning around her. Gambling debts? Oh yes, dear cousin. Uncle Whitfield had developed quite a taste for high-stakes poker games in the mining camps. Unfortunately, he was better at losing money than making it. Patterson was sweating. Now, his eyes darting between Charlie and the Ridges, like a trapped animal looking for escape. By October of 1859, Charlie continued, opening the portfolio to reveal a stack of documents, he had embezzled nearly $3,000, more than enough to bankrupt the bank and destroy every family in Cedar Ridge who had trusted him with their life savings. "How do you know all this?" Tobias asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "Because I've been investigating it for months," Charlie replied with obvious satisfaction. "The railroad requires clear title to any land we acquire, which means researching the financial history of previous owners. Imagine my surprise when I discovered that my own uncle was a common thief." He pulled out another document. This one, bearing official seals and signatures. "This is a confession," he announced, "written in Uncle Whitfield's own hand and sealed in a safe deposit box at the Denver Trust Company. He details everything, the embezzlement, the gambling, and yes, the fire." Nora reached for the document with trembling hands, but Charlie pulled it back just out of reach. Ah, he said mockingly. "We're not quite ready for that revelation yet. First, I think Judge Patterson has something he'd like to share with us. Don't you, Judge?" Patterson's face had gone ashen. "Charlie, we had an agreement." "We had an arrangement," Charlie corrected. "You would keep Uncle Whitfield's crimes buried, and I would ensure that certain financial irregularities in your own accounts didn't come to light. But circumstances have changed." "What financial irregularities?" Tobias demanded. Charlie smiled, that cold, calculating smile. "It seems the good judge here has been skimming from the court's trust funds for years. Nothing too dramatic, just enough to support his wife's expensive tastes and his son's education back east. But when combined with his role in covering up a major embezzlement case, well, it paints quite a picture of corruption, doesn't it?" "You bastard," Patterson breathed. "You promised—" "I promised nothing," Charlie snapped, his pleasant facade finally cracking. "You made assumptions about my generosity, just like everyone in this pathetic town makes assumptions about everything else." He turned back to Nora. "And Tobias," his expression triumphant. "Here's what really happened that night," he announced. "Uncle Whitfield set fire to the schoolhouse to destroy evidence of his embezzlement, bank documents he had hidden there, thinking no one would look for them in such an innocent place. He never intended for anyone to be hurt, but he was willing to burn down half the town if necessary to save his own skin." "Then why?" Nora began. "Why did you take the blame?" Charlie finished. "Because you're a fool, dear cousin, a sentimental fool who thought protecting Daddy's memory was more important than your own life." "But you knew," Tobias said, his voice deadly quiet. "You've known all along that she was innocent." "Of course I knew." The confession spells it all out in excruciating detail. Uncle Whitfield was very thorough in his self-recrimination. "Then why let her suffer? Why let the town believe she was a murderer?" Charlie's laugh was genuinely amused. "Because it served my purposes perfectly. As long as Nora was a social pariah, as long as she had no credibility or standing in the community, she couldn't contest my family's claim to the Whitfield estate, including the mineral rights to this entire valley. The pieces finally fell into place for Nora. You're not here for the railroad at all." "Oh, but I am," Charlie corrected. "I'm here representing my own interests, which happen to align with certain railroad investments. When the Denver and Rio Grande extends through this valley, the mineral rights alone will be worth millions. And thanks to your father's crimes and your willing martyrdom, those rights belong to me." Tobias had gone very still beside her, and Nora recognized the stillness as dangerous. This was the man who had saved 43 soldiers, who had spent years tracking down truth through lies and deception. "There's just one problem with your plan, Charlie," Tobias said quietly. "Oh? And what's that?" "You just confessed to fraud, conspiracy, and extortion in front of witnesses. And unlike you, I actually know how to gather evidence that will hold up in a court of law." Charlie's confident expression faltered for the first time. "What evidence?" Tobias reached into his vest and withdrew a small device that Nora had never seen before. A portable phonograph recorder, the kind used by court stenographers in the larger cities. "Every word you just said has been recorded," he announced calmly. "Your confession to fraud, your admission of extortion, your conspiracy with Judge Patterson to cover up financial crimes. All of it preserved for posterity. Charlie's face went white. That's not legal. You can't record someone without their consent. Actually, in matters involving criminal activity, territorial law is quite clear, Tobias replied. And, as a licensed investigator, yes, Charlie, I still maintain my credentials. I have every right to gather evidence of ongoing crimes. Patterson had sunk into his chair, his head in his hands. It's over, he whispered. Dear God, it's all over. Not yet, Tobias said grimly. First, we're going to clear Nora's name once and for all. Judge, you're going to convene a special hearing this afternoon. You're going to present that confession Charlie mentioned, and you're going to publicly exonerate Mrs. Ridge of any wrongdoing in the schoolhouse fire. I can't, you can, and you will, because the alternative is federal prosecution for judicial corruption, conspiracy to commit fraud, and accessory to extortion. I don't think your wife would enjoy visiting you in territorial prison. And what about me? Charlie demanded, some of his bluster returning. You think you can just destroy my business, my reputation, based on one conversation? Your business was built on lies and stolen property, Nora said, finding her voice at last. My father's crimes don't give you the right to steal what rightfully belongs to others. Rightfully belongs to others? Charlie laughed bitterly. You gave up any claim to righteousness when you let an entire town believe you were a murderer. You could have told the truth at any time, but you chose martyrdom instead. I chose to protect my father's memory and spare my family further shame, Nora replied with quiet dignity. What's your excuse for 15 years of deliberate cruelty? Charlie had no answer for that, and in his silence, Nora found something she hadn't felt in years: peace. The special hearing took place that afternoon in the town church, the only building large enough to hold everyone who wanted to attend. Word had spread quickly through Cedar Ridge that the truth about the schoolhouse fire was finally going to be revealed, and it seemed like half the territory had turned out to witness the proceedings. Judge Patterson, looking haggard and defeated, read her father's confession aloud to the packed congregation. The document was thorough and damning, detailing not just the embezzlement, but the desperate decision to destroy evidence by burning the schoolhouse. It confirmed everything Nora had suspected, but never been able to prove. Let the record show. Patterson concluded in a voice barely above a whisper that Mrs. Nora Ridge, formerly Blackwood, formerly Whitfield, is hereby exonerated of all suspicion in connection with the fire of October 15th, 1859. The evidence clearly establishes that she acted heroically in attempting to rescue the trapped children, and that she has been wrongly blamed for a tragedy she sought to prevent. The silence that followed was profound. 15 years of hatred and blame dissolved in a single moment of truth. Frank Morrison was the first to speak. Samuel's uncle, the man who had led the charge against her for so many years, stood slowly in the front pew. I owe you an apology, he said, his voice thick with emotion. We all do. We let our grief blind us to justice, and we made you pay for crimes you didn't commit. Others began to speak then, halting apologies, expressions of shame, promises to make amends. It was more than Nora had ever dared hope for, but she found that the validation meant less than she had expected. The years of exile had taught her that other people's opinions, good or bad, couldn't define her worth. What mattered was the man standing beside her, his hand warm and steady in hers. What mattered was the life they had built together, the love that had grown from desperate beginnings into something real and lasting. 6 months later, Nora stood in the garden behind their cabin, watching Tobias teach their newest family members how to tend the vegetable rows. The children had come to them through Doc Henley, orphans from the mining camps whose parents had succumbed to disease or accident. Mary, age 10, who reminded Nora painfully of herself at that age. And Tommy, 8 years old, whose bright curiosity and infectious laugh had brought joy back into their quiet mountain home. The town had offered to name a street after her, to build a monument to her heroism. She had declined politely. Some wounds, she had learned, healed better in private than in public view. But she had accepted one honor, a request to serve as the new school teacher for Cedar Ridge's children. The position came with a small house in town, but she and Tobias had chosen to make the daily ride rather than give up their mountain sanctuary. Some mornings, when the mist clung to the peaks and the children's laughter echoed through the valleys, Nora felt like she was living in a dream. The music box still sat on her windowsill, its broken melody floating through the evening air as she prepared dinner. But now it played alongside other sounds, children's voices, Tobias's quiet humming as he worked, the comfortable bustle of a home filled with love and purpose. Sometimes the broken things were indeed the strongest, she reflected. They had survived the worst that could happen to them, and in surviving, they had learned to create beauty from the pieces that remained. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Nora felt the last of her. Ghosts finally lay down to rest. She had been chosen after all, not just by a desperate proposal in a dusty street, but by the quiet daily choice of a good man who had seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself. And that, she thought as she called her family in for supper, was more than enough.